before we get started, you're a teacher. You're out there in the organized doing fighting the good fight. Before we get started talking about some of your kind of career highlights, can you tell us how'd you get started? How'd your educational journey begin?
Uh, I'm from the Bay Area. I'm from Berkeley, California. I think let's see. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I've seen so many of the videos that you've put together with a lot of people that I admire. So I appreciate you just doing this, and just appreciate you in general, your art, your poetry, and so forth. In terms of my academic journey, I think it starts with my grandfather, who was a bracero, who worked in the Woodland area, who at some point in the 50s and 60s was like, I think uh, we're going to try to make a home here in the United States, and but he didn't want to work in the fields anymore. So what he did was he found work in the Bay Area as in the factories, especially along the West Oakland corridor. There was a lot of factories there that worked on sheet metal and other kind of industry. And he was able to bring his daughters and his wife, my grandmother, to the, steadily over the period from 1965 and on, due to the kind of family reunification programs that you would see throughout that period. And my mother arrived here around the mid 1960s, and precisely for that reason of an education. My grandfather was big on education. He wanted his daughters, and he had about 9 daughters at the time that were, working back in El Rancho in Acámbaro, Guanajuato, and they were brought here to get an education. Unfortunately, though, part of the thing is that a lot of immigrants who once they arrive, they find that having to work is one of the necessities of maintaining a family and so forth. So even though my mother eventually received a GED for some of these programs that the Chicano movement was responsible for creating, especially night schools for a lot of kind of first arriving immigrants, she she ended up working first as a waitress and then as a seamstress. Um, you know, as but I think that instilling of an education was something that my mother and my father instilled in me and my brother and my sister, in terms of gaining an education, getting the best possible education. And I went to Berkeley schools, which in and of itself is, an interesting kind of journey in and of itself, just because Berkeley schools had many programs, obviously, that were institutionalized from a lot of the social movements of the Bay Area, particularly Black Panthers and other programs. I'm a product of bilingual education when there was bilingual education. Most of my teachers, K through 6, all of my teachers were all Latino or Latina. In fact, they were mostly Latina. I had 2 Latino professors, teachers. And that's rare for a lot of, I think, folks, especially brown folks, to have that experience. Um, a lot of my friends growing up, their parents were part of the movement. They were part of, the kind of Central American solidarity movement in the 80s. I mean, it was something where you not only get an education, but you also get politicized. And I think growing up in Berkeley, there's no way for you not to be politicized in relationship to what's going on throughout the United States and especially in California. I'm first generation in terms of graduating and first going to university and graduating with a degree. My older brother graduated also from UC Berkeley around at the time that I entered UC Berkeley. And, part of it was, I majored in Chicano studies and anthropology, but I was definitely more on the Chicano studies side, having helped as a student at Berkeley High School initiate one of the first Chicano studies programs and departments in the country. So that was part of the kind of education that I was accustomed to receiving already. The questions about ethnic studies, furthering the field of ethnic studies, thinking about education as one of the many sites of struggle, not the site of struggle for many of us. And I'm also a product of the 90s, which is, for many folks, a very difficult time for brown and black folks in California. Obviously, you have the Los Angeles rebellions, which impacted not only Los Angeles but also the Bay Area. You had the growth of this kind of the reemergence of anti-immigrant policies and so forth in terms of Proposition 187. The growth of police, kind of a police state that attacked many of our youth in particular. And being raised in Berkeley and also in Richmond, California, I saw a lot of the things that many youth of color saw, and in terms of gangs and in terms of all of these different forms of violence, but I also saw the forms of state violence that constantly bombarded our community. So I think in part, staying local, staying at UC Berkeley for my degree, led me to think about higher education and what it meant to maybe do the type of research that could be of service, that could be of substance, that could speak and engage the movements of the time, especially the youth movements of the time. My education also started I think in many ways in '94, when I picked up a New York Times newspaper and saw that several hundred poorly armed indigenous rebels took over the town of San Cristobal de las Casas and the Zapatistas, and that started a whole re-education process for me in terms of thinking about what dignity means, not only for youth of color, but also what it means in relationship to the kind of activism that was going on in universities or in universities throughout California and the United States. I see Miguel Paredes that you had prior, similar to his kind of politicization and education during that time, Cal State Northridge being one of those epicenters for not only Chicano studies historically, but also in terms of working with the Zapatistas and so forth. So at Cal and in other places, it was also about learning and reading, continuing the long legacy. I know that you've been, for instance, doing readings of Marx and Capital. Well, that type of reading, but in relationship to also the communiques that were coming out constantly in the 90s, reading them as they were like poetry, and you know how that feels as a poet, to read poetry and be just impacted by words again, and words that were always founded on action. So that led me, to some reason, I don't know why, I still question myself as to why, to pursue a PhD. And I pursued a PhD and finished my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. And that was, in and of itself a unique experience. Never have any family in Texas. But it was probably one of the most wonderful experiences I've had, because there's such a genealogy of struggle there that oftentimes gets reduced to it being, a place of Republican kind of stronghold and so forth, and not seeing that type of struggle. And in Austin, I think at that time in the 2000s, it was about building community. It was about, having conversations, really around not only around research and what whether you call it activist research or militant insurgent research, and what that might look like for many of us who wanted to not have to live two worlds: our activism, and our kind of academic research. We wanted them to speak to both of them, especially because it is through our activism that we were producing questions, that we were asking questions, that we were encountering things. And so I think Texas was that place where I was able to fine tune a lot of those tools. So that's, kind of my trajectory, at least, and so I finished the PhD and moved on as a lecturer in Chicano Studies at Berkeley.
Yeah. So, one of the things you mentioned though was that you were waiting on the communiques as they would come out, and then
Mm-hmm.
kind of have study circles around those.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting to me. Like, so can you expand upon that? Can you tell us the story of those study circles and how they kind of like how they formed and what yeah, give us the dynamics of that.
Yeah, and the study circles, we read about these now in terms of especially some of the elders of the 1960s and 70s. You hear stories of folks walking on Sproul Hall in Berkeley with on one pocket the Red Book, Mao's Red Book, and on the other Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and having those kind of discussion circles, places where you would read, have conversations, political education, as we would more than more the kind of the term that we would use. And it's not that it had gone or had disappeared, but that we were hit hard in the 70s and 80s, and I remember the 80s in all of its superficialness, but also in its violence. It's a very difficult time for our families, and and it's also one of contradiction because our families, uh, many of them received, for instance, amnesty, but many didn't, and so we kind of see that. And so the reading group became almost an invitation. The Zapatistas definitely invited for folks to engage them in these communiques that they were writing, the ones that Subcomandante Marcos and others were writing. And I remember at Cal we would gather folks whenever they would come out. Especially, you saw a whole series of communiques that would come out from '94 to around '96. In particular, because you had 2/3 of the Mexican military in Zapatista territory. So a lot of the communiques, you started to see the formation of a particular praxis, some political ethos that would become, that we would know as Zapatismo. And so when we would read these things, they were obviously not just like in the traditional communique. It wasn't like, here we're just going to, raise arms. They were telling stories. The stories of El Viejo Antonio, the stories of Don Durito, the stories of, creation stories of the Sotil, Quetzal, Tojolobal, Chola, and other native peoples in Chiapas. And so, for us, it was learning the question of history, learning the question of how to create an analysis, how to produce an analysis of capitalism, because that's what also they offered. I mean, their first communique that they came out with after their declaration of war was an analysis of Chiapas's place in a global capitalist society. They gave us statistics for those people that are like, nah, you're all wrong. Nah, it was like, here's the statistics. This is what the UN says. This is the place of Chiapas. This is how it's viewed, across the world, and we were like, yo, there's something here to learn, right? There's something here to learn for us in terms of how we can also produce our own analysis of what's happening in barrios throughout California, what's happening in the United States. And so it was a matter of not only learning about what their struggles, but also how it applied to ours. And when you're 18 or 19, and you would think that there, especially in the university, that would be a part of it, but we weren't necessarily learning how to create that kind of analysis in our classroom. And so I think the Zapatistas were a whole different university, or some folks say pluriversity, all into itself.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of how I think the reading groups, lended themselves to. And even today, I try to practice that with my students all the time. When we think about, I bust out some of these communiques, or even some of these more current ones, and let's start reading. Let's see, what do we see here? How does it apply to us? That type of thing. And because I think it's an invitation.
Yeah.
And that invitation is something that we can't forget.
So UC Berkeley, it has a reputation, kind of an outsized reputation for being this very, very, being this kind of bastion of whatever, like right-wing people tend to call it the People's Republic of Berkeley and all this kind of stuff like that. But the reality is that Berkeley is actually rather, I mean, commanding heights of Berkeley, as it were, pretty conservative. I mean, if you like John Woo and all kinds of other people come out of it like that. So can you speak to like what the realities of Berkeley are, as opposed to like kind of the mythology?
Yeah, there's many Berkeleys, right? There's born and raised in Berkeley. Um, I didn't know about the university until probably about eighth or ninth grade. At least to what it actually was. So that's not the experience of everybody at Berkeley, right?
All right.
Berkeley is divided between those who are in the hills and those who live in the flatland, those who lived in West Berkeley or South Berkeley, and their lived realities are different. And if it wasn't for the public schools, we probably wouldn't even know each other in that sense. So I think there's that education, but then there's the one that you mentioned too in terms of Berkeley and its view of it being this bastion of, in particular, liberal thought or liberal practice in politics. And it isn't. Yeah, it isn't. I mean, what university do you know that has any, radical professors? If not one, and that person is usually um, marginalized, even in departments like ethnic studies. They're marginalized in the university. They're not given any kind of position for them to actually, in service committees or anything like that. And Berkeley, I think, is exactly that particular type of university. It definitely has weeded out, and if not, created prima donnas of certain folks that are viewed as radical in certain departments, but don't really have any kind of connection to any kind of community or any kind, any history besides that. And I don't want to, diminish the fact that they might be brilliant thinkers, because some of them are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, they hold a place in the many communities that struggle every day. So that I think Berkeley lacks. And the fact that Berkeley has been a hotspot for fascist white supremacists and is part of and part of the kind of lackadaisical way that administration and even faculty have kind of like not confronted that, gives you some kind of sense of what Berkeley is. But I will say this: there's a lot of students and a lot of community that did not take kindly to them coming to campus and taking up space that they shouldn't be taking up space. And I was there when Milo first attempted to, and I remember that night, like what was it, 2017, around there. I remember that night clearly because there was a whole group of folks who were protesting outside of our student building, and I saw a lot of my students there, and I let them know. I said, okay, look, the type of things that you should at least pass on as advice, and say, look, make sure that you have your numbers written on your hand or your arm, just in case something happens. Make sure you know where each other is at. Know your ins and outs, because the strategies of the police they practice them on you all constantly are practicing this form of police state. And sure enough, when a black bloc was formed, that's when I told my students, and because my students had never seen a black bloc, I said, all right, folks, this event is not going to happen. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, the compas, but the comrades are coming and they're going to close this down. I said, so, be on the lookout for there to be any kind of police repression. And I think that's the kind of, things that we need to pass on to folks who, as they're being politicized, instead of saying, no, nonviolence, no, peace. This was peaceful. There's nothing peaceful about white supremacists taking over your campus. There isn't. And it can only, there's, I think in that sense, be only confronted with what other people might consider violence, but I think it's our acts of survival. So I think in that sense, Berkeley, has been, playing that game of like the both sides type of thing. I will say that, in the students that I've met and engaged with in across the political spectrum, I've built with, I've built with,
Yeah.
and I had these conversations.
Yeah.
and I've asked questions, and they've asked questions of me.
Right.
And why isn't that exactly what educators do, right? It's
Mhm.
not about telling them exactly how they should do or how, it's about giving them experience that you have, but not laying judgment on them. And if you're not willing to be side by side with them, they're going to let you know. They're going to let you know. And I think that's, part of, I think, you know, the power of being a student, and at the same time of being in a place like the university, as dangerous as it is. I think that the university is a dangerous place, especially for folks of color, especially for queer folks, especially for folks that are again not meant to survive in that space. Um, so I don't know what the job of the educator is there in letting them know where the minefields are at, letting them know where the cimarrones and maroon society, places that we the caracoles in our university are at, building those types of locations, right? I think those are some of our tasks, amongst many other things that we have to you know, be
Yeah.
doing in the university.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, obviously you see Berkeley, like many places, is a side of struggle. All I meant to say is that this like idea about Berkeley is like this
Mm-hmm.
unilateral, like just this bastion, this that. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
that's a myth. I mean, largely it's the administration itself that likes that myth to be put out there, because
yeah. I mean, they have a free speech cafe. I mean, you know, it's like you can, you know, and that's the difference. When I worked at the Eastside Cafe, when I was doing, doing research, but also working with the Eastside Cafe folks, my mentor and elder, like Roberto Flores, would always says, these are mental mochas, that the Eastside Cafe has, because we don't serve coffee there, right?
Yeah,
And so, when I think about that and how much I learned from the Eastside Cafe in El Terreno versus, a free speech cafe, where you're literally commercializing a struggle. I think students are wise to the game when it comes to that. But you're right. It's that's one thing, and the other one is to also be able to know that 50 years of ethnic studies at Berkeley, being the second ethnic studies department in the country that emerges out of the TWLF next to the Third World College at SF State. That's similar. You can't always, um, or at least invoke the 50th anniversary whenever you want to. You should be living the practices, and definitely, continue to have that conversation or that reading of what our TWLF elders have left us, and continue to speak to us with, because there's tons of elders that continue to do that work, especially around ethnic studies at
yeah.
Berkeley.
So I want to get into some of your current work. You're talking about, I think you do some work on the housing crash of 2008, and yeah. But before we get into that, I want to ask you a question. Since you did watch the previous interview, were you as taken aback by Miguel Borida's ability to debate himself?
Um, I said that Miguel Paredes, and again, I know Paredes, I know Miguel in a lot of contexts, in a lot of different places too. What we would say is, the streets of San Cristobal, the Altos of Chiapas, the South Central Farm, Tijuana, as he mentioned, and I see that Felicia Montes commented, and Felicia was one of the people that I just enjoyed so much during the time that we were organizing along the border. And so, if you don't know Miguel in his fullness of being able to contradict himself at the same time, argue with himself, and everybody's kind of like, well, you kind of took our argument from us.
Yeah,
We wanted to say something here, Mikey, but you let us. You did it for us in a sense, and I think he does that, on purpose, so that you know he can get away without us kind of scolding him. I guess I don't know.
yeah.
It's that kind of.
A little angel on his shoulder, a little devil on his shoulder, and he was just like, and there was just no purpose for me to conduct the interview. It was really.
I don't know about no little devil or a little, yeah, I don't know. maybe the angel's a little smaller and the devil's a little bit bigger.
All right, so I want to get into some of your work. So you do a lot of work for the 2008 housing
Hmm.
crash and how it affected Black and Latino families at
Yeah.
just horrific rates, way beyond the general public. So can you first of all, can you just like give us like a brief just a brief overview of just how devastating 2008 was for Black and Brown families?
I mean, part of my work is ethnographic, so I started this work just because, and it's connected to my family, just because I had a lot of family members and friends who lost their homes. I mean, and then to say when I say lost their homes, no, their homes were stolen from them.
Mhm.
Their livelihoods were taken, and criminal acts. So we call it a crash. Uh, you know, Oftentimes we say, capitalism's most current crisis, then it's called a crash or some kind of form like that. We feel the effects of that crisis, especially when it comes to dispossession. And so, when I started to hear stories from family members of them losing their homes, and then the other thing is you always got to trust your senses. Living here in Richmond, California, in Sao Paulo, in Richmond, California, and not so much in Berkeley, because Berkeley again is always, especially now, has been, you see, maybe we could talk about that in a second. Just the price of housing there is ridiculous, which in of itself pushes a lot of people out, of course. But in Richmond and in Sao Paulo, what you saw was so many different people have to sell their homes, had their homes foreclosed. I mean, you can drive down 23rd Street in Richmond. You could drive down McDonald and then to some of the, kind of like North Richmond locations, and families were just, you'll see the signs, foreclosures and so forth. And then, so a lot of that was like, damn, my block, which is right next to Richmond High School, there were so many houses that were just now empty. There were so many houses where families were living there. And, what does that do to our community? I mean, that was the question. Anytime you build a sense of this might be something you want to research, it has to, again, be grounded in the lived realities of people. And, for me, it's always been the lived realities of how I've been politicized. So, taking all of those teachings by elders and folks that I know and love, but also, the Zapatistas, having been doing the work with the Zapatistas for 15, 20 years now, that, using that to think about the housing crisis, and was to then see all these, vacant, and families who used to live in certain places have to, leave and not know where they went, right? Not know where they went. In the Bay Area, Black folks who were pushed out of Oakland, dispossessed of their homes, went to, for instance, Pittsburgh and other places deeper into into parts of the Delta. Stockton, you saw so much of that happen in Stockton with Filipino, Black, and Latino families. And so when I started to then look at stories and collect stories, and one of the ways was, through family members, people who knew someone who had also lost a home, I started to start building a map, in a sense, a map of not a geographic map per se, but a mapping of folks who had lost their homes, what stories they were telling of, how they ended up buying the home, first of all. Then, in many cases, how the housing system, in a sense, that they entered was predatory, as we kind of have been more aware of since the 2008 crash, and then how that impacted them afterwards, in terms of the stresses, the health effects, the interpersonal effects of having to pay, an extraordinary amount of money to stay afloat. We're proud people. We really are proud people. And I talked to folks in their 50s and 60s who thought this is something that they were going to be able to leave to their family and their children, and las penas, like having to tell a kid that they're not going to have a yard anymore. that they're going to have to move in with family members where you have an apartment with like two or three families. You started to hear these stories, and I'm just like, damn, like, and that that easily could have been your home, or it could easily been your family. My parents didn't take out any other kind of like refinance loan at that time or anything. But I know a lot of families that did, and it disrupted relationships and so forth. So what I found then was the sense of an attack on our dignity, something that you can, I mean, it's like, well, dignity you can't quantify. Bullshit. You can quantify dignity, right? And it doesn't have to be through wealth, or at least how most economists think about this situation. For me, then I started to hear the stories, and one of the things I heard from a lot of folks was that when I asked the question is like, how did they get the money for their down payment? How did they get the money, save their money? Many of them had sold their lands when they were in Mexico, or sold whatever possessions they had from Central America to come to this country, not only to get here in terms of paying a coyote, but also just holding that money so that they would at some point be able to use that money to buy a home here in the United States. So I want us to think about that. Their dispossession of their land, their ejido land, in Mexico in particular, led to them buying a home here, thinking, el sueño americano, and then they get dispossessed of that. If that doesn't let you know about the question of dispossession and coloniality and the racial capitalism, I don't know what does. Right? That is literally generational trauma around that capitalism creates. And there'll be I also met and I also talked to the predatory folks, because there was a lot of brown folks that just preyed on our community, and a lot of them were young, brash, were making a ton of money, giving out these loans. And giving out these loans to who, if not their family members and friends? And they were hit, but they weren't. They were the ones hidden, and they were the ones not telling the truth, and they were the ones not, definitely not helping the situation in a sense. So when you start putting this kind of story together, you're starting to see then that we're still seeing that impact. Yeah, we're still seeing that in relationship to how our communities are not able to own their own homes now. They're more enclosed. They put up fences now. They don't want to go outside, or I rarely see kids now in Richmond play outside as much as I used to. I used to play outside every day, even when there was like a lot of the homies that were wrapped up and they were norteño, sureño. They would at least know that when kids are around, that kind of stuff, they always took it to the side, that type of thing, but there was at least kids playing. We don't see that anymore. And I think that has to do with a sense of like all that trauma, all those things that had to do with not only 2008, but also the raids, all these things that are also tied to this question of the housing crash. And, it's taken me a while to try to collect this. One of the things about being a lecturer is that you don't have research money. The research money is your paycheck. And, sometimes that means not being able to pay certain bills and so forth, to be able to further it. And to me, it's a matter of like how to be able to respect the stories that have been told to me, and the ones that are still, to be told, that folks want to, are dying to tell and so forth. So, that's kind of where I've been going with that kind of research. I want to know more about that intergenerational dispossession, because I think it's important for us to really, conceptualize how that works. And I know that in your poetry you do that as well, and a lot of other poets do that, and artists as well. And good friends that I respect beyond words, Jesus Barraza and Melanie Cervantes, are constantly using art to do that, right? To kind of give us a sense of a weapon to fight with, especially when it comes to issues like housing, health, immigration, and so forth.
So some of these people that you talked to that were dealing these predatory loans to friends and family, were they kind of people that were like fell in this like rubric of like independent loan officers or whatever they were
Yeah,
called? People that didn't act, they weren't actually bankers. They were just like people that Ameritrade had hit up. They were out of work, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, they're working for Ameritrade or they're working for somebody like this,
yeah,
slinging stuff.
and they're all. It's not that they weren't. I mean, they were indirectly tied to Bank of America and Wells Fargo, right? And Chase and Citibank and so forth, right? Because a lot of the offices that they worked in had a subsidiary of some of these banks. So even though uh, you know they weren't working for the bank per se, they were definitely doing the bank's the bank's bidding in a sense. Um, and these were young folks. I mean, these are folks again who were making tons of money. But the other folks I think that also get unnoticed are the ones who were flipping homes, and then this is happening, happened before 2008, um, where both family members that I had, but also folks that I knew in the neighborhood were flipping homes all the time, and that is first of all, flipping homes is a racist practice.
Yeah.
It's a racist practice. It who you sell to is still a question of like certain uh, especially black, in particular, black folks are at the tail end of that. They don't get sold homes because of, kind of the anti-black nature of housing and the way that, especially both Latino and Asian people that flip homes viewed black tenants and black home ownership. But at the same time, you start to see these kind of interracial dynamics that I'm still trying to, it's definitely on my radar uh, of folks who are flipping homes. Yo, in my neighborhood, as soon as a house would get, foreclosed on, there was already like two cars of mostly home Asian folks who would come and ready to offer cash to people who wanted either to sell their home or try to get above water, or who would have some kind of connection with some of these banks that were foreclosing. Granted, in Richmond, you had certain politicians that were really trying to keep people in their homes, and I was also trying to look at that where they had folks, philanthropists, and other folks who were like, let's try to see if we can help folks who are drowning in debt by keeping them in their homes. Uh, but capitalism is like hell no. Remember it's this individualistic kind of nature of pull yourself up, and if you can't, well, it's your fault, right? That type of attitude versus collectively actually helping each other in these moments of need. And so there's all these different kind of things that were happening, especially in Richmond and in other places like Oakland, that I think are tied to this question of as predatory folks. Um, and literally, it could be your cousin, and your cousin will show up in a Mercedes, and you'd be like, dirt poor, right? And your cousin be like, "So what are you doing?" It's like, "Well, I got a PhD. I'm a lecturer. How much does that make?" And you tell them how much you make, and they're like, "Ah!" They start laughing at you because they making all kinds of money. And it's kind of like folks who used to slang, folks who used to slang weed or whatever, drugs or cocaine, used to do the same thing to me too. So it's they pushing stuff too, and I'd be like, well, maybe it's a question about your conscience. I'd be like, well, you know what you're doing, right? You're doing this and you're doing that, and they'd be like, oh God, here we go. Tell us what we need, and so that's something I still haven't kind of been able to figure out. But I think it's a conversation that we have with each other, and it's not about like young folks being that way, or again, but it's something that I think the lure, the fetishism that racial capitalism brings and so forth. But it is anti-black in nature, and it is racist as hell. Um, and it's making its head known even today when we see what is called a recovery of the housing market, which I don't really think it's a recovery. It's just still just the same kind of Ponzi, but in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. So, but of all the groups, the Latinos lost the most wealth during the housing crisis. Is that not right? Is that in
What's that?
of all the different like ethnic groups or of all the like basic cacategories that they have in the United States,
Hmm.
the Latinos
Yeah,
they lost the most, right? They took the biggest hit in personal wealth, right?
yes, percentage wise, but I still think the impact on Black folks and especially working and the working poor, it by far it impacted I think Black folks um, the most across the country. I think in California I think is Latinos, and in part again it's part of that sense of like um, much of their earnings to save up money and their aspirations were tied to this sense of like, wow, this is an opportunity. I don't have to put in so much down. I could own a house. Yeah, it's 500,000 and it's probably only worth 100, but we could do this if we manage the money this way, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and Latinos just like black folks, um, they we don't we're one paycheck away from unemployment if we get unemployment, especially folks who are Black and Latino undocumented folks. We don't even get unemployment. So there's that sense of like as that wealth that we're talking about is even there. I think a mirage because uh, how can we call that at all any kind of wealth when you're just basically one paycheck away from being taken from your house or having your children taken away because of all kinds of other reasons and so forth.
Yeah.
So
Definitely leverage debt. So okay, I want to ask you about this other thing you got going. Can you tell us a little bit about Autonomy Road?
yeah, it. Have you? I mean, I'll ask you because you're an artist writer. Have you ever had a project that you wanted to complete and tell the story of and work on, but it's just like no se estaba haciendo, like no se está haciendo in the way that for whatever reason you're like, am I the one to tell it? Um, at, like there's a lot of trauma in writing it. I don't know if you've ever felt that way.
Like sometimes, but I mean, like I kind of like I try to like I'm part of the reason I write and do so much, or part of the reason I'm so like prolific or whatever. I'm just like trying to outrun any time I have to spend alone with myself. So like
Yeah.
a lot of the reason that's the reason I work so hard is because I don't want to hang out with me. So whatever
Well,
whatever problems I have in writing or how difficult that is, it's not nearly as difficult as a quiet moment with me.
well,
So that's
and
that's it.
I'm glad I'm glad you're sharing that because, like I said, I need some reinforcement when it comes to um, when you're writing a manuscript or a book, especially in academia, everybody thinks it's for the purposes of tenure or getting a tenure track job. Nah, this is a story that's 20 years in the making in terms of the activist organizing work that obviously Miguel Paredes alluded to in terms of urban zapatismo of Chicanos and Latinx folks you know who were inspired by and continue to be inspired by the Z's in Chiapas, by the compas, and it's both a personal memoir and also an ethnographic work around that that particular moment. Also, the work that when I was in LA, which I sorely miss being in LA. I'm not in LA, uh, you know, you know, yeah, maybe I could be a transplant and y'all be like, haha, laughing at me. I think Paredes did a lot of that while I was there. Uh, but I miss LA for all of its imperfections. And the fact that there was certain moments when I was there that there were so many things that we definitely dreamt of and were now at least an imperfect reality, whether it be the South Central Farm or things like the other campaign that Miguel Paredes mentioned. And Autonomy Road, actually, the name of it is taken from Marta Gonzales and Quetzal Flores' Quetzal, the group's video on which song is it? The Elegua, Elegua, their song Elegua, where there's this street sign that's called Autonomy Road. Instead of a one way, it says Autonomy Road. And in the video, Quetzal, the group, has to decide on either taking, this kind of like stardom road where they would have to put on these costumes, fake eyelashes. I mean, the video is brilliant and the song is amazing. I love that song still. Especially Marta and Gabriel's vocals in that. And there's this other road that's Autonomy Road. So on one road, they're like, this is, they look like NSYNC, they're just like singing to this kind of like fake crowd. And they're like, nah, this is not us. This is not who we are as a group. We value the circle. We value all these different things. And so they come back and they take the other road, the Autonomy Road. And that one is of community. That one is of a sacred circle. That one is of sharing. That one is of having a particular proximity to your audience, which I think Quetzal in their videos and in their songs always keeps true. So that proximity is about sharing and having that same kind of reciprocal relationship with their audience. And so Autonomy Road for me was the sense of like, yeah, that's what it is. It's a road that we must choose. And in Los Angeles, what is the road to choose, right? Is it the road of capitalism and, savage capitalism? Or is it to build something anew or continue to build something? And, the history of LA is one of, as you say, resiste. It's of that, right? Whether it be, the Magonistas in the early part of the 20th century, or if it's, not any of the other mass movements and organizing that happened in LA. So part of it is that sense that Autonomy Road is that ethnography of that experience that I had of living in Los Angeles and building and working with folks. This is the summer of that. I'm working on completing that, and it's taken me a while. Like I said, there's certain things, Matt, that I know I know some of your folks that you've actually interviewed probably know. I mean, I have video of when the South Central Farm got bulldozed that I have not looked at since I was videoing it, and in part it hurts too much. I mean, I know that for a lot of folks who might be watching this or maybe watch it, they know the feeling of that. Like it's something that you can't watch. It's something that is just it conjures up so much that you're just like, what do you do with this, right? And I think part of it is being able to write that is difficult. Also, I don't mind the spilling of dirty laundry in any kind of book, especially one like that, because it brings dialogue. But one to go after compas in particular. So it's not something like that, like, oh, you're going to tell all the ins and outs. No, I think books around social struggle, books around organizing should have or should allude to and spur questions first, right? But then the other one, it should give you the tools that are helpful in organizing. So what's not a tool of organizing if not the inter relationships that organizing, that folks who are organizing do, and how people end up hating each other and not talking for a while and coming back. I mean, so a lot of times I know a lot of people say, well, you gotta wait for that. You gotta wait for that. Shit, I've been waiting for a while. It's like, there's a lot for me to put out there to be able to be like, okay, how do we make sense of this? How can this be of service to folks that are organized now? Not necessarily to not make the same mistakes, but to really be like, okay, yeah, this still is true. And I don't want it to happen through TV shows like Gentified and Vida. I might go into a little rant here. It'll be a short one. I appreciate Gentified and Vida and the fact that a lot of folks love the fact that, these are programs that are this and that. But when they got to this question of activism, man, I ain't feeling that. I mean, a lot of it, there's a little elements of it that are true, but a lot of that, that was acted out poorly in the way that some of this stuff goes down. And so, there really isn't any way to act out what happens in organizing circles. There really isn't. Although it's important for us to know those, because especially the power dynamics, when it comes to gender, when it comes to so many other things that are continuously a part of organizing circles. But I think to see it in, like for instance, a TV show or something like that, usually they do not do it justice. They do not. And that's also been one of my writer's blocks. How do you do justice without just either glorifying something that you don't, not necessarily should be glorified, or, how do you tell a story that will spur dialogue? And are you prepared to be one of the facilitators of that dialogue? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's also a fear of mine. Am I one of those people that can be the facilitator of that dialogue? I mean, that's, we're oftentimes trying to look for folks like that, and I'll take on that task, and I'll take on the whip, definitely the scars. I'll take the scars or whatever it means to that, because I think we also have to be humble to what folks are saying. So I think Autonomy Road is that project that I think it at this moment right now it's time for it to complete. And there's a couple other projects that are tied to it that I also need to talk about. One of them that Paredes alluded to was the Estación Libre work, which is the transnational work that I worked on for like 10 years, which I think is on par with what we saw, the internationalism that we saw in the Panthers and other groups, throughout the last 50 years, and be able to tell those stories, I think, is something that I'm really hoping to do at some point.
Yeah. So like where can people connect to your work and to you and to all the goings on?
Well, thank you. A couple of things I want to plug in. First of all, that I'm constantly trying to work on or build podcasts with my students, and so I started a SoundCloud where I put up a lot of their podcasts. I did 2 of them, particularly on Chile. Had some compas from Chile who talked about the situation in Chile in the fall, and a good friend of mine who talked about the raids of poultry plants in Mississippi, which is still very, obviously something that right now we're seeing in terms of COVID-19. And that SoundCloud is SoundCloud / Radio Caracol. And so folks can hopefully, listen to a lot of the podcasts that my students put together on the criminal justice system, on abolition, on environmental justice, and future podcasts that I'll put together. You could reach me at my email at aslan71, and I have no problem saying aslan71. Yeah, for those. It's been my email, at least as aslan71, since I was in high school, like Prodigy, like that's how old school. So it's I ain't got no problem with it. And aslan71 at berkeley.edu, and you can email me if as I say to folks that I talk to, especially young folks, now that I've, whether it be over online or in person, now that we built this kind of, relationship and dialogue, I offer myself in whatever way y'all would want. So not only you, Matt, but everybody who might be at some point watching this, I offer myself in terms of being able to build that dialogue and so forth. So, you can reach me via email. Most of my information is available on our Berkeley University website. I'm building a website, so whenever I get that, I'll send it to you, things of that nature, just to put up a lot of the things that doing both in my classes, and then to also highlight some of the things that I want to start working on as I miss organizing. And I said, I know a lot of people will say, well, shit, why don't you organize? Yo, a lot of us got whooped. You know what I'm saying? And it's tough. And I'm not one that's gonna say that, oh, I'm in the university, that's my organizing. Shit, I had a lot of friends or a lot of folks that I admire who also said their activism is in is being a professor. I'm like, nope, that's not it. That's not it at all. And so, part of it is wanting to build community. Organizing is building community, sustaining community. And so, you know, I'm more eager than ever to do that, especially because of being shelter in place, and missing a lot of the people that I continue to build with. So yeah, those are the ways that you can get in touch with me. And y'all will be the first to know when that manuscript is done. And I'm putting it out there for everybody to Twitter storm it. You know what I'm saying? And call me a cultural nationalist and stuff like that. You know how it goes.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the stuff that I mean, like, I think sometimes we forget that like we're a very small knit community of people that like care and talk about all these histories. And then secondly, the trends can go really fast and they can spread really fast, and then counter trends can spin really fast. So I think a lot of that stuff that people were talking about, all this politics about like Chicano studies are inherently this and inherently that. I think a lot of that's been pushed back. I think a lot of that has. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just my own experience because nobody fucks with me.
Yeah, and I know you've had this. I know you had this conversation with a lot of folks, that I know and that we admire as well. And it might go in a lot of different directions, or it just might go in circles. Just do your homework.
Yeah.
That is a lot of those folks not only acted on the work, that is, whether it be Chicano studies or the Chicano movement, but are still here. They're still here. You can ask them how things went. You could read, because a lot of folks have been out writing about this. I mean, God forbid that we not only have things that have been written, but also painted and created to still show the power of community and what that meant. So look at that, right?
Right. I just
contextualize, just at the basic level. Contextualize, historicize.
Right. I just feel like I feel like you don't owe unprincipled people a principled discussion, and so like my response to a lot of the stuff that happened when they kind of started attacking me was just to outproduce them. Like you're gonna attack me and I'm not even gonna respond to your attacks. I'm not gonna respond to your critiques. No one's above critique, but no one's above having their critique dismissed. And so like, I just and when you outwork them and then it becomes about working, they typically drop. And so that'd be kind of the advice I have to people who might want to like continue producing, who see themselves as a link in a chain. There's all these things that came before them. There's all these things they intend to touch after and influence the next generation. You see yourself as part of a continuum, right? And addressing those who want to break the chain, who want to destroy the continuum, it's a waste of time. Just like it's just stay productive, stay making things, stay whatever. And these people, typically speaking, a lot of the organization is around people who don't want to do their homework. They don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
They don't want to do anything. In fact, they want to lower the bar to a lower level of productivity so that they may thrive, because no one's doing anything, because everyone's so guilt-ridden about doing anything. So the bar is so far lowered that nobody's productive and nobody finishes anything. And that's my.
And you know what? I agree, and I think
I'll say it live. I don't know.
Chicano studies has to take the blame for a lot of things too. And I think maybe this is for a different conversation at a different time, but we have to take the blame for a couple things, and I think one of them is where the field maybe has detached itself in many ways from some of at least those guiding beliefs of dignity, and in a lot of ways. Not necessarily. I mean, I know that will catch a lot of flames, and that's cool. We can have that conversation, and I say that because whenever you see the opening for folks to be able to again be able to talk about our insurgent fields like ethnic studies and Chicano studies, Black studies, Asian American studies, they're able to do so because there's an opening. There's an opening, not of dialogue or conversation or where we can discuss these things, but one that is filled by the lack of thought, lazy thought. and I say lazy thought, the way that the Zapatistas talked about it in their masterful essays that they had during the semilleros that they had, years back, where they said, "What we need right now is critical thought, not lazy thought. We ain't got time for your lazy thought." They were like, "Nah." And that, how do you build critical analysis? You do it through collective. You do it through this way. You do that. Lazy thought, we ain't got time for it. There's a lot at stake. And I think Chicano studies, in a lot of ways, when it, in its institutionalization of a lot of different things, became a little bit complacent in that sense. That's my. There's a bigger critique I have of it, but I think that's one of. At the same time, I do agree with what you say. That what is it? Is our organizing or our understanding and our politicization solely critique?
Yeah.
Right? Are we only critiquing each other? Like, no me gusta cómo te vistes. No me gusta. That in of itself is reproducing the very nature of the hierarchies and things that we're definitely trying to dismantle. And I think critique. Olvídate. I mean, anybody can do that. I could do it from right here.
Yeah.
From this mic.
I mean, critique is like good, but I mean, like, I don't know. Like, I honestly, I don't accept critique from anyone I wouldn't accept advice from.
Yeah, well, that's another thing, right? Like, who are you? Yeah, you're like, okay. How many followers you got? Okay, so that's supposed to mean what?
Yeah,
that type of thing. Yeah, I can understand that.
What I mean by that is just like somebody that like I work with or do work with or knows what I'm trying to accomplish and knows how I'm trying to like get things done and like the kinds of things I do, and they have a good idea of it and like, okay, well you did that this time, but last time you did this way and it was more blah blah blah. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, hey man, look at this. I got this thing. Look at this. Check it out. I don't know, what do you think? And like if I would never have this conversation, like, what do you think? Then I'm never gonna like listen to you tell me.
I agree.
Wrong because
yeah, I mean,
cool.
I agree. I mean, it I feel like it happens every month. Like there's a reoccurrence of something, and it's painful. I mean, maybe I should maybe it's not for our eyes anymore. And like you said, you found a way maybe to just say, nah, I'm not gonna pay attention because I know where this is going. Mm-hmm. But it's not, again, the other thing about critical thought, it's provocation. And I tell this to all my students, especially my student comrades. I say, I want you to provoke back.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between that type of, like how we think about provocation as building of critical analysis and provocation just to provoke and pick at something, right? Until somebody snaps back and then be like, I told you they were going to snap back. And I told you they were going to be that way, right? That's different. That's not the type of provocation that we need. Mm-hmm. And, I know this sounds tired in that sense and be like, there's a lot at stake, but there is. And I do believe that we need to do away with erasure. And I do believe that we have to, value and give space to voices that oftentimes have been erased and so forth. That's not even what's at stake here when we're talking about that. If it was, then it's something that we could have a dialogue and be provoked by, and be like, okay.
Think about the national consciousness of this country, right? The idea mm-hmm. that there is an overbearing Mexican understanding of U.S. history is absurd. Right. That is an absurdity. That is offensive. That is ridiculous. I mean, most people, they know they have the right to remain silent, but they have no idea about what Miranda versus Arizona was. They understand like all these kinds of things. They don't like, and we ourselves, we don't even know, like, say, like Pershing Square, where everyone does all their organizing. They don't even know to be offended by Pershing Square. We don't even know who John Pershing was. So the idea that Mexican history is just overwhelming, everybody and everywhere, and then like nobody can do anything because the Mexicans won't stop talking about their lives and their history, is ridiculous. The United States, everyone in the United States needs to learn more about Mexican American history. Everyone needs to learn about the Mexican American War. Everyone needs to know about these things because they're the things that are dominating the politics. When Donald Trump says Mexico's sending drug dealers and rapists, that has like 150-year history or longer in this country of those types of politics, and nobody knows them, at all. And so, like, except for like people like Chicano studies over here, right? And so the fact that it's not known to the general public that you can trace that statement through a historic timeline of statements like it is just a complete unknown to the general public. And so the idea that we need to do less China studies, the thing that we do less understanding the Mexican American border, that we need to do less understanding these populations and how they are targeted and why they are targeted and where the targeting comes from, and not more, is absolutely absurd. It's absurd. And
Yeah,
should be
I saw that you posted. Well, I saw that you posted prior, like the question of the Mexican American War, and it's precisely that, right? The Mexican American War was the was the was the audition for the United States across the hemisphere, if not the world, uh, to them to build U.S. imperialism. Not that they didn't themselves practice it already on Haiti and a whole bunch of other places as well, but the U.S. Mexican, U.S. Mexico War was definitely you saw those names, you saw the Robert E. Lee, you saw, as you pointed out, the Ulysses S. Grant, you saw, all of these people gain their training through a war against a population they viewed as, a half-breed population that thousands of miles away in New York City, they were learning about it in newspapers as, savage, bloodthirsty Indians.
right.
And at the same time, though, we have to be careful not to, and this is not to contradict what you said, but to say what other folks have said, which is that we also have to know that the project of white supremacy and the projects of racial capitalism and so forth are deeply embedded even in the construction of the Mexican as a foreign other and internal enemy, right? And that Mexicans also, in many ways, thinking about their own projects, their own kind of state crafting, did so in the extermination of native peoples, both in Mexico and in the U.S. Southwest. But that's part of how we understand the complexity and understanding of settler U.S. Southwest. That's not like in as a completely different story, right? It is still threaded in that.
Of course.
And Chicano studies has been saying that story for a long time. So I think exactly what you say is right. And I tell folks is like, if we understand the formation of the U.S.-Mexico border, we understand the formation of other borders.
Yeah.
Right? If we understand what's happening on the Mediterranean Sea, we understand what might happen at the U.S.-Mexico border. There's also something that we can learn from other contexts as well.
Yeah, but I also think like when you have somebody targeting Mexico, right? That the idea is should not be. If someone says something like these Mexicans are the thing you should not do is be like, well, America's always been anti-immigrant. Let us think about the Know Nothing Party. Look at Ireland, look at Poland. What about the Chinese Exclusion Act? What about Bull Connor? What about no? When someone says something about a group of people, you should stay with that. You should stick with that, right? You should stay there. So when you talk about MS-13, you should look at like the history of El Salvador, the history of U.S. El Salvador relationships. When someone talks about someone during the COVID crisis, when there's all this anti-Chinese rhetoric, right? Study the Chinese Exclusion Act. Like whatever the topic is, treat the topic with the respect of belonging to a historical timeline, and that the idea that you shouldn't do that because Mexicans are somehow unworthy of having a struggle. Because that's what this was all about. Right. Then like that needs to be confronted. Like that just needs to be confronted. And when someone like just starts trying to fight, then I don't know. In my opinion, you fight them. And if you're gonna fight, we're gonna fight. And so,
right.
Fight.
Friend and comrade and colleague Daphne Taylor Garcia was posting that in her in their recent Facebook around that very same thing. It's like, since when did Mexicans not face like state violence and lynching and all kinds of stuff? Like, since when? Like, are we like, what's going on? What are we talking about here? Right? Like this sense of erasure of that history as well. And a couple of things, especially if the site of understanding those histories is the university. I don't think it is completely or exclusively, but if it is, how are we teaching, for instance, that history, right? How are Chicano history courses, for instance, being taught?
Mm-hmm.
And what are they? What stories are we telling that maybe speak to exactly the kind of way that histories are told and not told, and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's one play. The other one is how are our students or communities learning those histories, and what are the takeaways? What is it that they're taking away from those stories? And if what they're taking away is like trash, they're trash. Look at what they did, and we ain't doing our job. Like we're not
Yeah.
doing our jobs in terms of making sure that those silences, as Michelle Ruffletrio would say, and it are not are a part of how history and power work together, and how narratives are constructed. We construct them right now. As I tell my students all the time, we construct those narratives of the past right now. And so when people are trying to rewrite those narratives, you have to understand why is it that they're trying to do that? For what purpose are they trying to do that? Who are they serving? And how is that going to be useful in relationship to, white supremacy and racial capitalism? Is it serving any purpose besides doing that? So there's lots. I mean, I completely agree. And I think this country is founded on anti-black, anti-indigenous, but also anti-Mexican, anti-Chinese, anti-Central American, uh, actions, continued actions, and so forth. Right? How do we try to say, nah, y'all didn't really face that? I mean, are we really in the position where we got to be doing that? I mean,
especially Trump. I mean, you have a guy like specifically saying, I mean, like, and he won't stop. So like, it's bizarre. But like
really
I say,
bizarre.
well, ridiculous arguments should be met with ridicule. I mean, that's where I come from. I know you can't take that same position, but officially,
Well, I mean, officially, what? Like I said, I'm a lecturer, man. Officially, I might be out of job next week, depending on what people, Newsom and Kristen and Napolitano say. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, officially nothing.
yeah.
And I'll tell you right now, I appreciate you because I think you live, I think, similar that way. Like, sometimes we just, I don't give, AF. I don't, it's something like you. Again, I've been in spaces and made compromisos and built with revolutionaries,
Mm-hmm.
right? With rebels, and those compromisos I take very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't lived up to all of them, but I try to live my life hoping that I can do so. And it's what partly has to be done, I think, right? It's like you make a compromiso, you speak con la palabra. If you go to a Zapatista community and you say you're going to do something, you don't do it, they're going to be hounding you for that. They're going to be like, but you didn't do what you were saying you were going to do. Y aquí se vive con la palabra, right? The word. That's what, when we say our word is our weapon, when they say that, that's also what they mean. That palabra means something, that you just don't throw words out there and expect them to stick on something and not expect people to speak back. I mean, that's one of the things, right? And so when we make these compromisos, then, as hard as they sometimes might be for us, they are a way of living. They are a way of breathing. And in my final moments, I hope it's a way of dying. And so I think that holds a much longer trajectory and genealogy, and I would hope those who are trying to take those, like dismantle those genealogies, are also practicing the revolutionary act of uncovering the many genealogies that have been erased. Like, I would hope, instead of just using people as target boards, that they're also themselves, in fact, trying to do something completely different, which is recover so many of those genealogies of hope that have been destroyed by 500 years, if not 500 years plus, of colonialism. And so I think, because that's what I'm down for. I'm like, let's do that.
Yeah.
That's what empowers me. That's why, we do what we do, I think, in many ways. So.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah. It was a nice interview that broke out into like all the arms and
All kinds of stuff, y'all. I,
yeah.
like I said, I appreciate you very much.
Well, I appreciate it, man. I appreciate coming on and talking and yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, hopefully we'll talk soon and I definitely yeah maybe
Oh
find
no,
some.
pues cuando se calme las cosas, as we say, te vamos
Yeah.
a traer, man. We're gonna bring you to campus.
All right, cool.
Somos, somos con poco dinero, pero somos locos.
Final thing is, I've done every UC except for Berkeley and Santa Cruz.
Uy,
So I've done
pues
all
ya.
these except for so except for the liberal ones, I've done all of them.
The so-called ones, right?
Yeah, well, I know
Um,
that's why I mean that's maybe that's why I got that little chip on my shoulder. Like me, you guys are. I've done UC
I don't know.
Merced.
We go. Uh, Merced folks are my people.
Yeah,
Um, all right.
Irvine,
Yeah.
Brookside, not all of them. You know, all these places are supposedly more conservative, but like it's
You know, don't believe the hype, man. Berkeley, we broke as hell. I mean, yo lo hago con pura, like that puro scrounge, man. Try to help out as much as I can. But at the same time, you know what?
yeah,
I, hay que darle el pago a la gente. I saw that article for like, formerly incarcerated students. I, a lot of my students, a lot of my friends and comrades that, that work for Underground Scholars and all these other programs and that do that work, they should be getting paid. They don't be, talking to classes and so forth.
yeah.
I mean, at least, when we say honorarium is to honor them, and I think, that also we include that to our writers and artists and other folks, our cultural workers who do that as well. So no, definitely, ahí encontramos la feria.
Okay, man. Well, I had Danny Mario on too, so like
Yeah, and I know that that Danny's first class was my Chicano history class.
I did not know that. That's
Yeah,
wild.
well, Danny's first class. Yeah, yeah. Me and Danny go way back. We go way back. I love the conversation you had with him. Danny's one of my heroes. One of my, I look up to him. He like I said, unassuming but and very humble. All the conversations I continue to have with him inspire me because of the work that he and others do to give voice to definitely the voiceless, the incarcerated, and formerly incarcerated. So, and the families of formerly incarcerated. So, yeah, Danny, yeah, definitely.
Well, Pablo, I really thank you for your time, and hopefully
Of
we'll talk.
course. Yeah, brother. Thank you so much. Eh?
And nos vemos.